Jai Prabhuji, hello. We are starting today a new chapter in our study of the book Experimenting with the Truth. Chapter that deals with a topic that is so relevant and significant to each and every individual, and a topic that for sure each and every one of us gave a lot of thought, contemplation, throughout his life, probably in different situations and times we might had different opinions about it. And this is the topic of freedom. So as always, we are starting with Prabhuji, with our reality, our typical understanding, our typical relationship with this term. And we will work with Prabhuji hand in hand through an examination that will give us more and more light and depth in relation to this topic. And as always in these journeys with Prabhuji, we are working toward the state of meditation, the state of transcendence, that as seekers of truth, as spiritual aspirants, this is the state that we desire. But Prabhuji usually does not jump there, but he helps us. He takes us step by step with understanding, with thinking, with acceptance of our situation and walking there, and not in a dogmatic way that we just want to accept something that currently has nothing to do with our reality. But as I see these journeys with Prabhuji, that I think we went through a few journeys already, I'm always very considerate with our current perception of reality, current understanding. And from it, we are working with Prabhuji into the things that he speaks to us about, things which we refer to the state that is transcendental to the mind, on which Prabhuji talks to us about, and many other individuals throughout history in different religions. That is the state of the awakening, of the meditation, of the observation. I said that in the previous chapter, we heard Prabhuji calls it a dimensionless state. I said it is transcendental to the time, transcendental to the mind. As aspirants, we want to be in this situation and be able to observe ourselves, a self-image, observe the ego and be detached from the ego, detached from the entanglement. And again, as I said, Prabhuji takes us into this state from our current illusion, our current misperception of reality, and helps us to break it down ourselves and not just accept something else as truth, but really realize it ourselves. If we attentively listen to Prabhuji, I think that it is easy for us to recognize what he talks about ourselves. And this is the great value that I see in these journeys. So today again, we are going into a journey in relation to the understanding of what is freedom. This is the question that is presented to Prabhuji, on which this article is an answer. And we're starting from what is typically accepted as freedom, most likely by most of us, and then we will see what Prabhuji shares with us regarding this understanding and why it is not complete, why freedom must be something else, and then we will walk with Prabhuji stage by stage into this freedom. So let's read. I have often heard you speak of freedom. What do you mean by freedom? Most people believe that freedom means escaping from life's limitations. They confuse freedom with overcoming oppression. The prisoner wants to be free from jail, the slave from the master, the depressed person from sadness, and the sick from pain. Freedom, however, is not the same thing as emancipation or release, even though they are synonymous in the dictionary. Emancipation means releasing oneself from something. Freedom, on the other hand, does not entail any kind of escape. It cannot be dependent on anything. So here, Prabhuji presents to us, reveals to us, usually what do we call freedom? We are free from school. Someone is free from jail. We're free from this sickness that bothered us. We're free from someone who annoys us. We're free from something that was burdening, that made us feel not free. And once we are releasing from this, we feel that this is freedom, right? And Prabhuji tells us this is not freedom. Why is it not freedom? It seems to us freedom. Why? How come? We're not in school, now we can go to the beach and do whatever we want. We feel this freedom. Prabhuji says this cannot be freedom because freedom is not an escape from something else. Freedom cannot be dependent on something else. So we already see here that Prabhuji talks about freedom as something that is independent. That's something that is not related to any event or any entity, but that has an existence of its own. And this can be very fascinating to us as human beings because we cannot imagine such freedom. What is this freedom that is not from something? How does it look? So let's continue with Prabhuji and understand better why freedom from something. So if what we call freedom includes the word from, it necessarily means from something, it means that this is not freedom. This is not what Prabhuji means when he speaks about freedom. He refers to something completely different. So let's understand further why this is not really freedom. Release from slavery is born from slavery and therefore remains an integral part of it. Its very existence depends on slavery, and thus it is not exempt from oppression. The same happens with relief from hunger or toothache. It is just a desire to exchange an intolerable situation for a pleasant one, that is, to exchange uncomfortable conditions for more promising ones. It is merely a reaction against what we wish to be released from. It is not a pursuit of freedom, but an escape from certain circumstances. Release from poverty is not related to freedom, but rather to money. Release from disease has nothing to do with freedom, but rather with medicine, pain, and hospitals. And release from slavery with shackles and prison cells. Okay, so here what Prabhuji tells us. When we are free from school, this freedom that we are experiencing is tainted with school. It's related to school. It has school as an integral part of it because this is its nature. It's a release from school. So if we used to go to school and now we have a vacation and we feel this freedom from school, we might have been in a very similar situation prior to being in school, but we did not recognize it as freedom because we didn't have this school experience that we wanted to be released from. So this is a not independent freedom. It's related to whatever we are escaping from. And same thing, Prabhuji gives here a list of examples. If it's a release from jail, if it's a release from sadness, if it's a release from disease, etc., etc., etc. The thing that we are escaping of is part of our freedom, and this is why we are not free. It is not a free freedom. It keeps on bothering us. We need this situation to be far away from us, or else our freedom will be disturbed. So I think that what we learn from Prabhuji here about this freedom that he talks to us about, that we still might have a hard time to understand. What is this freedom that is independent, that is totally free, that is not in relation to something? How does it look? What we learn from Prabhuji about this freedom is that it is freedom that it's necessarily not an escape. It's necessarily not relative. It's an absolute freedom, an absolute freedom. It's necessarily not temporary, because any temporary freedom is not freedom, because soon it will end. We are bothered by its end. Before it didn't exist, we are bothered by this experience that we just ended and we are afraid to go back to. So it must be not temporary, but permanent. So not relative, not temporary, not an escape, and not dependent. It cannot be related to any other thing, any other entity, any other person, because then this person still controls this freedom, still disturbs this freedom. Freedom must be independent, or else it's not freedom. So let's continue with Prabhuji to walk into this freedom and learn more about it. What else Prabhuji tells us about this freedom that is not temporary, not relative, not dependent, and not an escape. Some live their lives running away from freedom because they are afraid to accept their responsibility. They are content with just imagining what freedom is and blaming others for their oppression. The people of Israel were released from captivity when they left Egypt, but they only became free on Mount Sinai when they accepted the responsibility of receiving the Torah. So now we learn another important point about this freedom. A point that might be less appealing, and it's the responsibility. We learn that freedom is not just fun. It's not that comfortable. It's not always favorable, and that we ourselves might not always like it. That we ourselves might reject it at this point or another, to this extent or another. And as always, I think the investigations with Prabhuji require a lot of self-awareness and honesty. We don't want only to picture ourselves as those who experience freedom or understand what it is, but maybe this contemplation and the understanding that we might not really want to be free is more favorable for our investigation, even though it might not be comfortable for us to witness. How come? We all want freedom. Freedom is a value that is very esteemed in our eyes. All of us perceive ourselves as human beings who favor freedom, who advocate freedom, who choose freedom, who see themselves as free, etc. But is it really the case in an honest investigation? So Prabhuji tells us this freedom requires responsibility, requires to be the owners of our lives. And in many cases, it is much easier for us to have someone else to blame, someone else to depend on, someone else that will give us answers. And this can be in different fields, we can recognize this. I believe personally that in an honest investigation, all of us will see this point that in many cases we just want someone else to decide for us. We just want to know what to do, how to do, when to do. It is true demanding to be always the decision makers, always the thinkers. And when we are the decision makers, the responsible on our lives, we are also the ones who make the mistakes. So responsibility also means to take ownership on our failures, on what didn't go the way we wanted it to go, and not put the responsibility for it on another party, on another entity, because then we are indeed releasing ourselves of the guilt, maybe, of the blame, of the discomfort, but also releasing ourselves from the responsibility on our lives. If someone else is guilty for our distress, misfortune, difficulty, failure, whatever, it means that we were not free and gave our responsibility, our freedom, to someone else. So what we see here, that freedom requires responsibility. We can take for an example the age of adolescence, in which human beings transit from being children to being adults, and recognize that this is an age of a lot of difficulty, right? It's like a psychological earthquake. We go through a lot of unpleasant emotional situations. And it is not by chance, because what happens in this age is that we, in fact, shift from being beings that are totally dependent, totally surrendered, that have authorities, clear authorities on their lives that tell them what they should do, what is forbidden, what is good, what is bad, when to wake up, etc., etc., etc. And all the world is very defined and clear. We shift from this experience into the understanding that really we are also independent beings, and we will need to make our own decisions in life. Although we have two beautiful parents that care for us and have a lot of advice for us and example in many ways, we might not choose their way. They might not always be the best example. And we, in fact, recognize they are not perfect beings as we used to think as children. They were for us the world, the answers to all our questions. In this age, we discover, and I believe the more intelligent we are, we discover it more harshly in a way, because this is an unpleasant reality, a difficult reality, to understand that this life is only in our hands. And I will correct and say not necessarily unpleasant reality, but it is likely that it will be transformative, that it will be significant, because the shift is significant. To understand that this life that has so many options and possibilities is for us to mold, is for us to decide how we want to live it. It's a great responsibility. And it is likely that it will not be easy, that it will not be light. It might not necessarily be unpleasant, but it is likely to be something very serious, and therefore for many of us it can be unpleasant. And this is why this age is usually a difficult one, a challenging one, because we are again shifting from the acceptance of ourselves as being dependent beings to the understanding that we are free beings, that we are responsible beings, that we are the owners of our lives. So what we see in this example is how freedom means also responsibility. As adults, we are more free than children. Even in the age of adolescence, we are more free than when we were 5 years old. But we have more responsibility, and we can make more mistakes, and we need to choose. And this can be very overwhelming. So Prabhuji tells us here, the freedom that we speak about, which is not the escape, which is not dependent, which is not relative, which is not temporary, requires responsibility, requires our presence, our decision, our intellect, our emotions. We need to be present and take a responsibility on this freedom that we want to have. We cannot only have freedom and enjoy the lack of limitations without assuming the responsibility. They go hand in hand. They are interrelated. In his essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin makes a difference between positive and negative freedom, both clearly reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The negative is freedom from something, meaning the absence of obstacles to action. The positive is freedom for something, the possibility of choosing the actions that accomplish our goals. So now Prabhuji presents to us a theory of a thinker of the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin. He was a Russian-British philosopher, thinker, who wrote a significant essay, what is considered a very significant essay regarding the understanding of liberty, in which he breaks down liberty into two types. One is positive liberty, and the other one is negative liberty, two concepts of liberty. And Prabhuji says that Isaiah Berlin speaks about these two types, one that is freedom from something that we mentioned earlier, that we learned this is a release, and also freedom to do something. We're free to do what we want, free to think, free to act. Both types, the positive, which is freedom to, and the negative, which is freedom from, both are reflected, Prabhuji tells us clearly, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? We have, for example, freedom from torture, freedom from discrimination, freedom from oppression, etc. And we have freedom to life, freedom to liberty, freedom to security, etc. So here we might recognize a more detailed explanation regarding freedom or liberty, breaks it down to two types, maybe a more rich explanation. But let's see what Prabhuji reveals to us regarding this explanation in relation to this freedom that we are talking about, which is the absolute freedom or independent freedom. The idea of freedom most people have is limited to these two types, positive and negative. Freedom from something and freedom to do something. The first is related to the past, the second to the future. However, both are merely psychological reactions and superficial types of emancipation. They go after our mental projections, not reality. Real freedom cannot be conceived from within the limitations of the mind, but only when the content of the mind is transcended. Interestingly, Prabhuji tells us, although we get here a description of two different types that might seem very different, essentially these two types are very similar. Both of them are superficial emancipation, the same of which we spoke earlier. We can recognize in both types, both in this positive freedom, which is the freedom to do something, and negative freedom, which is the freedom from something, the same elements that we recognize in the beginning of the article that we spoke about. Both of them are dependent on something, on someone, on some action, on some material conditions. So they are dependent. Both of them can be temporary. They can be taken from us. Both of us are some escape of uncomfortable situation. They are improvement of some material conditions. And both of them are relative. They are not freedom in themselves, but they are freedom in comparison to another situation. So we need to compare another situation in order to determine that this situation is freedom. If we didn't have the other situation to compare it to, we wouldn't necessarily call it freedom. We might even had called it oppression in comparison to still a different situation in which we perceive ourselves as being more free. It means it's still relative. So again, we see that Prabhuji points out to a freedom that has nothing to do with the material conditions and that has nothing to do with the mind. Prabhuji tells us real freedom, that is not this emancipation, that is not a release, can only happen when the mind is transcendent. Transcendentally to our mental perception of reality. In the previous class, we spoke about the difference between being situated in the line of time that we said as egos, as self-images. We are living in the line of the time and perceiving ourselves only in the line of the time. Our significance is in relation to our past and future. Here we see also this liberty are related to the past and to the future. We are free from something, or we are free to do something that we maybe didn't have the freedom to do before, the liberty to do before. And we spoke in the previous class about a state that is transcendentally to the line of time, that Prabhuji called a dimensionless state, that is not dependent on anything that happens on the line of the time. We spoke about the here and the now, that Prabhuji revealed to us how these terms refer to a state of being, which here clearly you can see Another name that we can give to the same state of being, that we can call it now, that we can call it here, we can also call it freedom. But not a freedom that is freedom from something, and not a freedom that is freedom to do something, but freedom that is independent, that is transcendental to the mind. Clearly, Prabhuji points to the same state of consciousness. In the previous class, which is the last class of the previous chapter, Prabhuji revealed to us that the state that we call here is not different than the state that we call now. They are not two different states. And that both means consciousness. Now I think we can add another name to the list, all of which refer to the same state, which is freedom. Prabhuji speaks about the state that is not related to the mind, that is not related to the time, that is not related to what was or what will be, that is not related to any other entity, that is not related to any material condition, again, but that is transcendental of all of this, of our story, of our existence as self-images. Of course, the state of meditation. Reasoning is nothing but a response to our conditioning from the experiences accumulated in our memory. Thus, thought is inevitably chained to this heavy load of accumulated experiences. So here Prabhuji talks to us about our reasoning, the intellectual faculty. It's a topic that we discussed in various classes. And we also spoke about the importance of the intellectual faculty in our spiritual journey. Prabhuji tells us our reasoning that we might perceive as free. We can say we are not free to act, maybe, but we are free to think what we want. We have complete freedom of thought. Prabhuji brings us doubts into this understanding by explaining to us that our thinking, our reasoning, even the most sophisticated reasoning, is chained by our experiences. In other words, each and every individual cannot think independently of all his or her many past experiences, circumstances. And experiences can be many life circumstances that each and every individual on this planet can have, right? We live in different times, in different cultures, in different countries, with different parents, in different schools, in different religions, and so on and so forth. And of course, we all have very particular psychological experiences, we can say, in the particular circumstances in which we were raised and grew up. The way we think currently cannot be disconnected, unrelated to all these past accumulated experiences that each and every one of us have. So as much as we think that we are thinking freely, it will be easy for us to witness and understand that really our reasoning is dependent on so many experiences and concepts that we received in our past. So we do not have free intellect. Is there a state of a free intellect? Can an individual really think independent of his past? As we just said, we cannot think disconnected from our experiences. And yet, of course, we hear about a state of a pure intellect. We hear about it in Hinduism and, of course, in different religions in relation to beings that are transcendentally to their egoic identification. Another expression of this state is that their intellect is free. It's not chained. It's not conditioned. They, of course, had different experiences that influenced their personality. But because they were able to situate themselves transcendentally to the identification with the self-image, they can think independently, unrelated to all these experiences. These experiences, what they create in us, in essence, are fears and desires. And in one word, we can say desires. We want. We have preferences as beings. And these preferences, these desires that are very powerful in us as individuals, are going to necessarily influence the way we think. We cannot think free from our desires because we are connected to this past, because we are recognizing ourselves as this ego, as this self-image that has all this past. Only once a being is able to situate himself or herself transcendentally to this past, to these accumulated experiences, this being can also think and evaluate unrelated to it, free, because it is not identified. In the Bhagavad Gita, a scripture that we bring here once in a while, we see that the one who told the Bhagavad Gita was Sanjaya. So the Bhagavad Gita is in fact a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna that was inside the conversation between Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra. And this conversation, in a way, it's inside the conversation that Vyasa, the author, tells us. So we have a conversation inside the conversation inside the conversation. The outer conversation of the conversation of Krishna and Arjuna is the conversation between Sanjaya and King Dhritarashtra, the blind king, who approached Sanjaya, who was his servant, in order to get knowledge about the battlefield. And what was special about this Sanjaya, the servant of the blind king of Dhritarashtra, is that Sanjaya had the ability to see and describe without being physically present in the battlefield. He had this siddhi, this specific ability. And Prabhuji says about Sanjaya that his name is he who lacks attractions and aversion. And because he is a being that lacks attractions and aversions, he has this ability to see transcendentally to where he is present as an egoic entity. And for sure, this is why Sanjaya was qualified to describe the Bhagavad Gita to all of us and the happening on the battlefield in a very objective manner, without any preference. We know that the Bhagavad Gita, or the story that is told inside the Bhagavad Gita, that is the war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, is a war between two parties. So we must have some neutral party in order to understand what was going on. If Dhritarashtra, the blind king, would tell us the story, we could not trust the details that would be told to us, because he had a preference, a clear preference, right? Dhritarashtra was in favor of the Kauravas and mostly his beloved son Duryodhana, and therefore he could not see it clearly. And he was blind, not by chance probably. And Sanjaya, who was a servant of Dhritarashtra, was totally objective, totally transcendental to any preference. And what it means is that he had a clean intellect. He had no preference. So he could describe to us what was happening. And this is an example of a pure intellect. And another reference that we can take from the Bhagavad Gita to this topic of the pure intellect is our Arjuna, who is our hero of the Bhagavad Gita, the spiritual seeker, who is coming to Krishna with difficulty, which was the difficulty to fight in the war, and Krishna walks him from the confusion into the light. Arjuna is a character that is going into transformation in the Bhagavad Gita and helps us also to go through this transformation from the lack of clarity, into the meditation, into the transcendence. And what we see in Arjuna is that in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, when he experienced difficulty to fight, and fighting was his duty, Arjuna, who was a very noble personality, a beautiful personality, a just personality, a warrior, a brave personality, had some egoic motive, some preference. He did not want to fight, and he preferred that this war will not happen. And when he approached Krishna with this mental condition, he had a lot of explanations and arguments that supported the position of not fighting and of ending this war. Arjuna's arguments were beautiful, were intelligent, were based on the scriptures, were noble, but they had one problem. And the problem was that he had a personal preference, which was also noble. He did not want to kill his relatives. It was a beautiful motive, but it was egoistic. So it was not ultimately beautiful, or what we as spiritual aspirants want to call beautiful. Because of this egoic motive, Arjuna's beautiful explanation, beautiful quote unquote, did not come from a pure intellect. He could not think with reason because he was emotional in this situation. And the process that Krishna walks Arjuna through will purify his intellect and help him to get clarity, to gain intellectual clarity regarding the situation, his position, his duty, and his spiritual life. So what we learn from all this is that as human beings, as much as we can be thinkers, intelligent, knowledgeable, etc., as long as we are chained to our egoic perception of ourselves, to the perception of ourselves as ego, to our accumulated past, to our psychological difficulties, traumas, etc., or patterns, we cannot think freely. So not only we cannot experience bliss in meditation, but also we cannot make clean intellectual examination and come to clear conclusions about our lives. This is why human beings that are not situated transcendentally to the egoic identification are necessarily in confusion. We are necessarily in confusion because we have preferences. The preferences is our life, the life of our family, the life of our community, the life of our country, whatever it may be, it's our side. And therefore we cannot examine objectively. And we need to recognize these points as spiritual aspirants, that as long as our examination is coming from some preference, we cannot consider it pure intellect. We need to recognize it. There is a beautiful analogy in Hinduism, which is an analogy of the body to a chariot. And in this chariot, that is the body, sits the Atman, that is our true self, our being. Inside this chariot, there is also the charioteer, which is the intellect. He's riding this chariot. But this charioteer, who is the intellect, is pulling or in charge of the reins that are controlled by the mind. The reins are the mind. And these reins are connected to the horses that are the senses. And these horses, these senses, are interacting with the world that is the roads. This analogy, what we can see in this beautiful analogy, soon we will read it in the verses from the Katha Upanishad, which is a reference in which we find this beautiful analogy. What it shows to us is this delicate situation of our intellect. The intellect is pulling the mind, and it has the ability to pull the mind, to pull these reins that are connected to the horses, and they can pull the horses and guide them in direction. But this intellect can also be pulled by the reins, who are pulled by the senses. Once our intellect is pulled by the mind, it is not qualified. It's a servant of our mind, that is a servant of the senses. So all our intelligence, the highest IQ that one can have, if it is in service of the senses that serve the mind, is doomed to confusion. Only once we take control as intellect and use this faculty of the intellect, or as Atmans we take control, and use the faculty of the intellect to guide us, thanks to the ability to think, to understand, to conclude, to the right roads, then the intellect really serves its purpose as being our charioteer. Then it's really pure intellect. Then it can give us a lot of guidance and help. And also as spiritual aspirants, even when we are not situated transcendentally to the mind, we can use the faculty of the intellect to guide us, because based on the understanding we can choose paths or actions that are more favorable for our decisions. So the point that we are making, the intellect can be in service of the mind, and then it is not qualified. As much as it can be sophisticated and knowledgeable again and intelligent, etc., it is not qualified. It can be even worse. If we are more intelligent to serve our whimsical wishes and desires, we are doomed to failure, to destruction, to confusion. But this intellect can also serve as the one who gives direction to the mind and leads the mind, subsides the mind, orders the mind, and then it can help us toward the transcendence of the identification with the mind altogether. Our understanding, we said, has a very significant role in our development of human beings, as human beings. But we need to be aware of the fact that once we have desires, fears, preferences, our thinking might not be free, might not be clean, and therefore we should suspect ourselves when we are emotional, when we have some personal connection to something, to some discussion, to some decision that we want to make. When we have personal attraction, we are more likely to not think clearly, and the awareness of this fact will help us to bring more clarity and more pure thinking. Necessarily, the recognition of the fact that we are emotional and that we are identified. So let's read these beautiful verses from the Katha Upanishad. Katha Upanishad 133 and 134. Atmanam rathitam vidhi shariram rathamevatu. Buddhim tu sarathim vidhi manaha pragrahamevacha. Indriyani hayana hurvishayam steshu gocharan. Atmendriya mano yuktam bhoktetya hurmani shinaha. Know the Atman to be the master of the chariot, the body, chariot, the intellect, the charioteer, and the mind, the reins. The senses, they say, are the horses, the object, the road. The wise call the Atman, united with the body, the senses, and the mind, the enjoyer. We are not free from our psychological limitations. According to Karl Marx, the economic structure of capitalist society defines how we interpret the world. As victims of this false class consciousness, we necessarily interpret the world from a viewpoint determined by our social class. Marx believed that the only way to disentangle ourselves from the limitations of this perspective and to be free was by understanding dialectical materialism and adapting socialism, which of course is highly debatable. As a matter of fact, political freedom does not exist because it only has meaning in relation to others. Various political movements have tried to impose their own concept of freedom and turned into totalitarian and oppressive regimes. So Prabhuji brings to us here an approach to freedom of another thinker, which is Karl Marx. We're all familiar with this name, without a doubt, that claimed that the reason we are not free is because we are in a capitalist society and we cannot think freely of this view of as being members or part of a capitalist society. So this is what he called, in short, what he called false class consciousness. We cannot see the world outside of this false class consciousness. And in order to see reality as it is, in order to be free, we need to liberate ourselves from this false class consciousness, which is the result of us being in a capitalist society. And then we will gain freedom. How we will gain this freedom? By reacting to this capitalist society in attempt to create socialist society. Right? This is what he called dialectical materialism. We can respond to the situation in which we are currently, and by this we will change the situation that keeps us in lack of freedom and bring freedom to our life. In short, the solution to our slavery as being part of capitalist society is in socialism, communism. Prabhuji brings the point of view that we can all easily recognize today in the light of the events of history, that as we saw, communist movements that tried to oppose the capitalist society did not always bring peace, harmony, freedom, tolerance, etc., but in some cases became very totalitarian. Many will claim much worse, much more oppressors, and for sure did not bring freedom from oppression. So what Prabhuji tells us here, that this is another view in relation to freedom that does not speak about the freedom on which the rishis speak to us about, which is an independent freedom, independent again of any entity, freedom that is not an escape, so it's not instead of being capitalist, now we will be socialist or communist, so we are free, cannot be related to any temporary situation, cannot be related to any entity, cannot be related to any escape, cannot be temporary, cannot be something that starts and ends in the line of the time. The freedom on which Prabhuji talks to us about, that in his view is the only freedom, is the only state that is proper to call it freedom, because really it is freedom, is a state in which we are not just free from false class consciousness, but free from false consciousness. The false consciousness is the consciousness in which we recognize ourselves as egos, as self-images that live in the line of time. As long as we have this false consciousness that we are beings that exist in the line of time and that we are connected to our past, we are not accessing the freedom that is ultimate freedom, the freedom that deserves the word freedom. We are conditioned not just by capitalism, but by society as a whole and all that it implies. Likewise, we indisputably lack the psychological freedom needed to access reality. So, Prabhuji tells us again, we are not only conditioned by false class consciousness, but by society as a whole. And here we see an important link between the society, what we call society, and the psychological conditions that keep us trapped. What we hear in this sentence that we just read, or two sentences, is that they are in fact one and the same. What we call the society, the outside words, all the opinions and messages and knowledge that we come in touch with in this world, completely linked to our psychological world that holds us trapped and conditioned by our mind. So the society nourishes our psychological chains, and the psychological chains serves the society. They speak in the same language. We can be influenced by the society, conditioned by the society, as long as we are trapped in our psychological patterns. A free being that is not conditioned by its mind, by its past, by its fears, by its traumas, by its desires, it's also not affected by the society. It's free from the influence of the society. As spiritual aspirants, we are desiring to be transcendental to the mind and transcendental to the influence of society. We do not want to be against the society. And we believe that we are better members of society if we are not affected by its conditioning. Because only there we can really think freely. Only there we can really contribute. Only there, as we learned in the previous chapter where we dealt with the relationships, we can be really tolerant, understanding, accepting, considerate, if we are not acting out of our personal agenda, which is our psychological conditioning. So here we see again this link between the society and the psychological conditioning, and the fact that not only specific ideology, specific type of society, specific doctrine is what keeps us lacking freedom, but society as a whole. Whatever society is, wherever we are, whatever we believe in, this society, which is the outside world, the outside individuals that have certain opinions, that convince us in certain ideas and perceptions of reality, is what keeps us not free. We can only be free once we think ourselves independently of the society, with the pure intellect on which we read in the previous words of Prabhuji. We can have pure intellect only when we are free from the society and free from the influence of the society, the psychological influence of the society, and free from our internal conditioning as egoic entities. Expressions such as freedom of thought or freedom of worship are nothing more than verbal stimulants that activate our conditioning. All of our ideas and concepts about other people, about the world, about life, and therefore about freedom, stem from our psychological limitations. Only by transcending this conditioning will we gain an objective perception of reality. Without a clear perception, aspiration for freedom is impossible. What we hear now is that the concept that we have about freedom, the feelings that we have about freedom, the notion that we have about freedom are not only not necessarily complete, not necessarily true, but they are an obstacle for us in our way to understanding what is freedom, to our way to real freedom, to be in freedom, because we have concepts. We think that freedom of thoughts is something noble and beautiful that we accept and believe in. Do we really contemplate about it day by day and exercise it? Not necessarily. We adapt it as a slogan. We side ourselves with people that like and appreciate freedom of thought. Did we give it enough energy in our own lives to acquire freedom of thought? Not necessarily. So and similar for freedom of worship, etc. So the result of the society in which we are situated and its influence on us, that it inherited to us different concepts, beliefs, ideas that we adapted and not necessarily evaluated ourselves individually. And only when we are separating from the society, separating from the slogans, separating from what we perceive as good and bad, and really examining, we can gain access to the freedom on which Prabhuji talks about, and to the free intellect, to the pure intellect, to the clean intellect. We must not favor something as the outcome. If we want in our investigation to reach to the conclusion that we are free beings, we cannot think freely, because this is the outcome we want to get. So we are not free to examine, and we are not willing to examine if we are not free thinkers. Once we are open to consider this possibility, we become more free. We become more free thinkers. Once we accept that maybe we adapt slogans without enough energy and thought and care and effort, we are exercising the care, the effort, the thought that we might not have exercised previously. So it is fundamental in our investigations as spiritual seekers and in life, if we want to gain clarity, is not to prefer a certain outcome, is not to have a certain image in which we feel better, we feel more beautiful, and we reject necessarily other images, because then we cannot examine with pure intellect, with objective examination. So Prabhuji tells us all our concepts about freedom, all our ideas about freedom can be an obstacle in our path in order to access freedom. So we are nearing the end of this article that, as we mentioned and as we have already learned to expect, is going to describes to us the state of meditation, and in this particular case, the real meaning of the word freedom. We started by other concepts, ideas, understanding about this word of great thinkers, of us maybe, and we are going with Prabhuji to the understanding of this word according to beings that were situated in freedom, in what is called in Hinduism moksha, or liberation, that awakened to the reality. So now Prabhuji, in the word that we are going to read, speaks to us about authentic freedom. What is really the authentic freedom? Let's hear and listen carefully to Prabhuji's words to try and understand what is this freedom that is not an escape, that is not relative, that is not temporarily really mean. Authentic freedom has an existence of its own. It is independent of everything and has no cause or motive. Absolute freedom simply is. The Sanskrit term moksha means freedom. Those who aspire to freedom are called mumukshu, one who aspires to the authentic freedom that flourishes from consciousness. True freedom is not physical, mental, economic, or sexual. If we find ourselves alone in the desert, a suitcase with $10 million would not increase our freedom one bit. Authentic freedom does not belong to objective, temporal, and therefore illusory reality. Freedom is subjective and belongs to the eternal and infinite consciousness. Since it is an intrinsic quality of our reality, freedom cannot be given or taken away from us. It is inherent in our true nature. Nothing and nobody external to us can liberate or suppress us. In fact, we do not even have the freedom to renounce our freedom. It is possible to oppress the body or the mind, but consciousness can never be limited. And final words, as always, are a meditation. We will end with this meditation, our class, when we understand that in fact we are already free. We cannot stop to be free. Prabhuji tells us that our authentic nature is freedom. When we say authentic nature, it does not mean something that we don't know what it is and this authentic nature. It is really who we are all the time, that we never stopped to be, that we cannot not be, as we read also in the previous words. So we do not need, in a way, in the spiritual journey to succeed to liberate ourselves, but only to recognize that we are already free. These beings that talks to us about liberation, about moksha, about awakening, about transcendence, are beings that are situated in their simple reality that is also our reality. Meditation is the only opportunity to recognize freedom without any kind of limitations. Only within the depths of our interior are we free from the body, mind, emotions, and all that we believe ourselves to be. The New Testament points this out. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. Absence of freedom means lack of consciousness. We are as free as we are conscious. Such freedom is not from something, nor for something, but simply to be what we are. Freedom is a return to the state of original and pure consciousness. Our authenticity is freedom, which is the divine source and origin of any virtue. When we transcend the relative, the absolute is revealed. When we go beyond falsehood, reality is unveiled. When the illusory and temporal is transcended, truth is recognized. And when we go one step beyond the ego, freedom is discovered. Only the recognition of truth will allow us to transcend the fetters of illusion and know who we really are. Jai Prabhuji.